that we just couldn't be doing this program on railroads here in Rockport without talking about the impact of the railroads on Rockport. And so while Rockport didn't build as Kingsville did, the railroad was tremendously important here to our community too. On the program, I'm listed as Pam Stranahan and local historians, and I'd like to give credit to a few people before I get started. One was the Fulton Mansion. He wanted me a slide program that they'd done many years ago that accompanied an exhibit that was at the Fulton Mansion. Jerry Brunbrett visited with me briefly this morning and has brought maps that show you the surveys, early surveys done, and the surveys of where the tracks went and the associated businesses around there. So I think you'll find those interesting. I visited briefly with David Murrah. Janie White sent me an article about one of the hotels that I'll show you that was built specifically because the railroad was coming to town. Also, Jamie has a great story of her family, her grandparents, right, married on the platform of the railroad station so that they could immediately get on the train and go on their honeymoon. So that was one of the things that happened. Cam Waggart wrote an article for our Rockport pilot about the SAP Railroad that also publicized this meeting, so some people probably picked up on that. And Tommy Schultz, who some of you may know is a big collector of railroad memorabilia, was contacted to bring some of his things that he has, but unfortunately, he was having another conference today in Flatonia. How many people thought they might go to Flatonia today? But you came here instead, okay, so thank you. Anyway, we have to keep up with Tommy Schultz in Flatonia, because that sounds like that could be really, really interesting too. Well, let's see. This is our absolutely favorite picture or photograph of our railroad depot here in Rockport, and it really, we use this a lot of times to talk about what was going on in Rockport around 1900. And I had thought, and what this postcard says on it, again, we're back to being the Chamber of Commerce, what this postcard says is, this is the crowd that met me when I came to Rockport, Texas. Okay, so it was printed on the postcard, and anybody who sent this postcard home had that as the caption. And we had always seemed to think that this was really the first train that came in, but it's not. The first train that came in was 1988. There were about 3 or 4 automobiles in this picture, and it could not have been that 1888 time period. This would not have been the very first time that the train came to Rockport. The San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railroad, of course, was a very important railroad called the SAP locally, and you have the idea that the Aransas Pass might be the town that is on Mustang Island, but that's not what it was. Okay? It was really an effort to come from San Antonio to the Gulf. Okay, so they were really looking to come to the Gulf, and at that time, both Rockport and Corpus Christi were vying for the channel that would be built. Okay, to bring a deep water port to Texas, and probably most of you, or if you've thought about it or gone back in history, you might realize that Rockport was really the better port town at the time. Okay, and, because you had a clear channel. None of them had real clear channels, but they had maps to get around all the reefs. Corpus Christi was not as ideal as Rockport was. But, as you can well imagine, politics gets into it. Not only politics, but the kings and clavers, and so the channel ends up going to Corpus Christi. But before that, Rockport was very instrumental in trying to get the railroad here. So it was called Aransas Pass. Okay? Rockport changed its name for 3 years in order to both identify with this channel, the prospects of this channel being dug, okay, and the prospects of the railroad coming here. So all of these things are tied up together and very misleading. And the first time I learned that Aransas Pass was really Rockport, I was really pretty surprised by it. So we even had our bank change its name, and it was called the First National Bank of Aransas Pass, but it was right over there on Water Street. Okay? So there was a definite effort there, and of course the channel was dug to Corpus Christi in the 1920s. Now, a lot of people had talked about railroads and bringing railroads to So we had a lot of efforts. Actually, James Power, who was an impresario here in the 1830s through 1880s, had promoted the idea. Mary B. Lamar was involved in it. James Byrne had pictured a railroad going to the Lamar Peninsula. And George Fulton had worked to do it. But the man who ended up getting it here was Uriah Lott. And you've already heard him referred to just a little bit. We talked briefly about who would talk more about Uriah, and so it turns out I have the privilege of talking about him. He's quite a promoter. I mean, an A1, number one promoter without money, okay? And so he did everything from shoveling when he needed to clear the land and make the grade, all the way from shoveling, whatever it took. It's really hard to separate him from this San Antonio Aransas Pass Railroad and just talk about that 18 miles. The part of the railroad, that 18 miles from Gregory to Rockport was tied up with all of these other things that Uriah Lott was doing. Let me backtrack just a minute. As you can see by my notes on the screen, he was born in New York in 1842 to a Dutch immigrant family, not especially well-to-do. He did have an elementary education, but nothing more. He did hire on the railroad, okay, in his area when he was a teenager. So he had railroad experience in terms of labor, not anything in management. And then he started thinking about what he could do, where he could make his fortune. And so he came to Texas, first to Brownsville, as you've heard, via New Orleans. And he was in Brownsville as early as 1867 and did a lot of work, met the Kennedys and Kings. And so he was associated with the groups that were doing a lot of work in Texas at that time because it was so wide open as far as what was really needed here. He decided after a while in Brownsville that he would come on to Corpus Christi. So he comes to Corpus Christi in 1869, and he has a company called U, Lott and Company. And this was a commission house. He was an agent. He took in wool and hides and then sold goods that came in by steamship. So he was the agent. He didn't have a mercantile, but he was the agent. And this was an important part of Corpus Christi, of course, in the 1870s. There was a huge exchange of goods that were coming through here, through Corpus Christi, from the valley, okay, and then going out by schooner. So this is a really, really important thing. He realized that what was very important would be the railroads. But as has already been mentioned several times, it was really a difficult thing to finance these railroads. And so he had to try to figure out what he would do about financing it. He and some of the men in Corpus were proposing a bond issue to get Corpus Christi to sponsor the railroad. Okay? But there was so much invested in ox cart at the time that the popular appeal really fell short, and they took that idea off the table before they ever took it to a vote because they didn't want to have a negative vote around. So it was the theory was, get rid of the ox carts? Never. And those were the big, huge two-wheel carts that traveled between Mexico and Corpus Christi. But finally, the next year, in 1875, Uriah Lott sold bonds and got some land grants from the state, as John has already mentioned. For every mile of railroad that you completed, you got 16 sections of land, which then you could sell. The going rate for a section of land at the time, however, was only $1,000. Okay, so you can get rent for $100. But Uriah Locke was not to be deterred. He borrowed $6,500 from Richard King, and with that, he bought an engine, used engine, and on that engine, in great big gold letters, he printed SAP, the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railroad. And by the next year, 1876, he ran an excursion train, 18 miles from Corpus Christi to Martha Rabb's pasture. People got on those cars with wooden back benches on them, rode out there, had a picnic, and rode back. So his idea, of course, was to show he had an engine, he had some tracks, and it was going somewhere. So you have to give it to him. As far as being a promoter, he was definitely that. One story that's really kind of amazing, he had a rail salesman with him one time, and they were going out towards San Diego by coach, okay, because they were just going to look at how to lay the rails and how much rails they needed, that sort of thing. And along the way, they came upon a party which was Mexican bandits, had stopped another stagecoach and had them tied up. They got Watt and his salesman, stripped them down to their underwear, and also tied them up, okay, and robbed them all. And then, fortunately, one of the people who had been tied up got loose and got into Bankhead, where they got help, were taken to a ranch house and clothed and able to get back to Corpus Christi. But that just shows you kind of the rough and tumble aspect of this rail line, of getting it anywhere. Then they had problems with yellow fever. Finally, Locke ran out of funds and actually sold the railroad to the Tex-Mex. This Tex-Mex railroad, nobody has mentioned, but it was called Till Manana. Because it didn't always go on time. So that was the local joke, Till Manana. Okay, so we have Locke kind of down on his luck and out of finances, but in 1886 he picks up again with this idea of getting a depot from Corpus to, from Gregory, excuse me. The rail had gone over to Corpus, but now we need the rail from Gregory to Rockport. So he picks up again, he gets old rails, he gets streetcar rails, and does what he can to put that together. And he does get money from Mifflin Kennedy to help with this, and he's able to begin that kind of construction that was needed. Now, in the building of these railroads, probably the hardest thing was building the trestles. He could put the rails on the lines, but trestles took some engineering and were to be somewhat substantial. So that was the hardest thing. And the trestle that was going to come over to Rockport had to go across a couple of the bays, so that was a serious problem.
On that picture, is that a sag in the trestle, or is that distortion in the photo?
I think that's a distortion, but I'm not really sure. There were several accounts, though, of big reps because of the weakness of the trestles. Yeah. This shows a survey team a little bit later, 1903. But again, this gives you the idea of who was out there trying to get it figured out. Where should this route actually go? How can it be put on the ground? And how can we make this work? The SAP was primarily considered a route down into the valley. That was, one of the things that was really important about it. Here we have some of the documents for the railroads. We have a pass for one of the administrators, and then we have tickets. And those tickets are interesting to me in that they are from Kansas City, from Iowa to Kansas City, and Rochester and Winchester. So we had a lot of people coming in for different regions. We're not just talking regionally. So here you have the map, essentially from the spot that it would branch off and get down here and get on, finally get over to Rockport over in this way. Okay, from Kennedy here on down to this Gregory station that you see there. Again, this is more likely what it looked like when our first train came in. It didn't have all of the platforms all the way around it. This is an earlier photograph than the one I showed you first. The first train came in July of 1888 with Charles Henry McLester as the engineer, and he's certainly one of the families that's still here in town, very active. And because everybody was so excited about the railroad getting here, George Fulton had a big banquet at his house and greeted everybody who came in on that train. This was so important to Rockport. One of the ways that you can see this is the growth in Rockport. In the next 10 years, from 1888 to 1898, the population grew from 600 at the time this first train arrived to 2,500 in 10 years. So this was a tremendous boost to Rockport itself. At the same time that this train came in, the last Morgan steamship left port and ended their contract here. So before the railroads came, the commerce for Rockport was certainly the port, handled through the port with the steamships that came and went, taking the cattle primarily out to market to Cuba, to New Orleans, and to the East Coast. And with the arrival of the railroad, the steamship realized that this was going to be it. But for Rockport, we became a tourist attraction. Imagine that. And of course, later we didn't get the channel, and that was okay too. But in Rockport, we had the Del Mar Hotel, which was built in, it's called the Aransas Hotel in 1889. And according to an article that Janie White had found, this was promised by the city, okay, to the railroad. In other words, we will make this improvement if you bring your railroad here. The builder and owner of the Aransas and Del Mar Hotel was Mr. Traylor, who was the former mayor of Dallas, who had moved down here to really help establish Rockport as a major spot. And out of this Del Mar Hotel, which had 50 rooms, and the dining hall that you see down here on the right would seat 200 people. They had a grand ball every Saturday night with a full orchestra. Their dining hall served turtle steaks, Taft ranch beef, and oyster cocktails. So it was a grand dining experience. Besides the hotel, Mr. Traylor also offered you an excursion on his private yacht. Okay, he wanted to do something like that. So again, it was the tourist trade that Rockport was active as early as those 1800s. Another feature was the Hertzfeld, or the Bailey Pavilion. It started being the Bailey Pavilion, and then was bought by Hertzfeld. But what you see here is a crowd coming and going from this wonderful pavilion. And if you can look closely, you can see some of the people coming on the walkway are in band costumes. So it really gives you a sense of what was happening. There was theater and concerts and dances, of course, obviously. You also had a bathing house off to the left. There were little stalls where you would change out of your outfits of the late 1800s into wool bathing suits. It wasn't swimming suits because they didn't really paddle around much. They just sat in the water and cooled off. And when you think of it, pre-air conditioning, in the 1800s, getting the Gulf breezes and being cool and enjoying the bay was a wonderful thing that you could do. The other building that you see, the small building that you see on the side with the wharf going there, was the Sorensen Wharf, and this went to the Sorensen Mercantile, which today, the building for the Sorensen Mercantile is the Stella Star Gallery, which you can still see down on Austin Street. Well, this wasn't the only action in town. We also had the Bayview Hotel, which was south of town and was put together by Mr. Brule, who was also a former mayor and the major pharmacist in town. We also had the Shell Hotel, which was a converted mansion that was especially of interest to sportsmen. So sportsmen came here for hunting and brought their families with them, and they would stay in this. Shell Hotel was one of their popular haunts. We also had the Plaza, which was built on Rocky Point. Okay, and Rocky Point is why we have the port of Rockport. Okay, the Plaza was wrecked by the 1919 hurricane. The Del Mar Aransas Hotel, Del Mar burned before the storm, but also in 1919. And we had the Conlin Hotel, which was also known as the Orleans Hotel. And that is famous because Clara Driscoll, the Driscoll family that was mentioned earlier from Kingsville, the Driscoll family boarded there when they first arrived in this area. Okay, also the rail went out on a wharf, okay, so that things could be loaded on and off. But stories go that people actually sat in their rail car and fished out of their windows. Now, I don't have a photograph and I have nothing but stories, but it makes a pretty good story, I think. So it was certainly very, very popular as a retreat, as you can imagine, and we still are today. Sportsmen came by rail. You saw all of the connections on some of the other maps, but the sportsmen came, and I one time put in a search for Rockport, and I found an obituary for a very prominent man in Kansas City. And this was in the late 1800s, and in his obituary, he listed the St. Charles Bay Hunting Club as one of the things that he belonged to. So he even had that put in his obituary, which tells you, just how far-reaching the sports network was. We have a number of clubs that catered to the sportsmen. So here you see them with some of their ducks and geese, and then the fish on the right-hand side. We also had commercial fishermen and hunters. And so they hunted to send all of their goods up to the East Coast or Midwest. The Bloodworth boys were the family that really did this commercial hunting and reported sending as many as 200 ducks in one day by barrel, by train, back up to the Midwest. The hunters actually also sent their goods back when they had done the hunting that they came down here to do. I'm sorry you can't read this, but I thought it was really interesting. This was actually later, 1904. The HEWT, which stands for Houston East West Texas rail line, but it talks about the timeline going from San Antonio to Rockport. And you started out in San Antonio at 9:45 p.m. and got to Rockport at 9 a.m. Okay, so then you could go on to Houston by 7:45. And then on to Shreveport, okay, from there. So again, this extended network of rail really brought Rockport into the world, the active world at that time. This rail, however, had a nickname also. I said it was HEWT. It was hell either way taken. Yes, people weren't too excited about this. This railroad sold out to the Southern Pacific in 1899. So, just an engine. I'm sorry, I'm not really a train person, so I can't tell you the origin of this engine, but there were 4 trains a day that came from San Antonio. 4 trains a day brought people on excursion trains down here. And then later, something that hadn't been really mentioned, but later, around 1910 to the 1920s, when we had a lot of land boom, we had a Professor Atwood, for whom the Atwood Prairie Turk Chicken is named. Anyway, Professor Atwood was here in town, and he decorated a railroad car with stuffed birds and agricultural products, and he would go up into Kansas City and further to tell people how rich things were down here and how much they could profit by coming down and settling down here, especially in the agricultural realm of things. And we do know we had a lot of really good truck forming for a while. Then we have, oops, let me see, did I skip one thing? Yes, not. Okay, here we have the map that shows you, again, our little 18 miles of railroad right in here that connected Rockport with the rest of the world as far as what was going on. So that was just critically important. This is a chart that shows that 18 miles, okay, from Gregory at the top down to Rockport. So we had McCampbell, Ingleside, Aransas Pass, Estes, which the origin of Estes is probably just that it was the East Bay or East Flats, okay, and it gets tangled up in the way people say it. What I found interesting is what they say was actually here, what the facilities were, okay, at Rockport. So if you look at that, it's FWYL. So that's fuel, water, Y, WYE, and yard limit, and of course, and Rockport was the end of the track. What a Y, and this was a new word for me, WYE, you got it, John? It's there was a triangle of track or the side track that a train, an engine could use for turning around, okay? So we didn't have a roundhouse, but we did have the Y or we, how we pronounce that, so I think that was pretty interesting. In 1886, we had 5 passenger trains and 3 locomotives. Now, Watt was never one to just bring up an engine and leave it the way it was. So those 3 engines that he had in 1886 were named Sam Maverick, Charles Hugo, and Mifflin Kennedy. And so he always made sure to credit those people who had been influential with him. This railroad went into receivership, as you've heard from some others, and here are some of the numbers that I found reported for why they went into receivership. They just weren't making any money. And so you see what the different costs were. The maintenance, of course, was huge, maintenance of equipment, and so they just weren't making any money. They ended up selling to the Southern Pacific. And by the way, we had a spur was planned to go all the way out to Live Oak Point. Those of you who are local know Live Oak Point is the end of our Live Oak Peninsula over on Pocono Bay. So that had always been an idea that, in fact, it wouldn't just stop in the town of Rockport, but it would take people all the way out to Live Oak Point, where another resort hotel was planned. But that just didn't happen. The right-of-way existed for quite a while, but it's now been sold off. There also was a spur between us and Aransas Pass for the carbon black plant, which is now no longer running. So I just have to give a little bit of credit to Uriah Lott, even though he was certainly a promoter and not always a finisher, but he overextended. He lived in New York City for a while. He took his children, even had one of his daughters educated in Europe. I don't know where he got this money, but he was really not very frugal in how he lived or what he did with the money. So he ended up going to the Valley in the 1890s, to St. Louis in 1902, Alice in Brownsville, you've heard a bit about Brownsville in 1906, planning even yet another railroad between Brownsville, Chicago, and Houston. But then he returned to Kingsville, where, in fact, the Clayburgh family took care of him by giving him a place to live and essentially taking care of him. He became ill and died within about a year in 1915. There was a proclamation by the Corpus Christi mayor. All the businesses in Corpus Christi closed during the time of his funeral, and he was buried in Kingsville. His biographer, All Hands, who writes a lot about different railroad around Texas especially, but he said, if the best in the world, sweet, tender-meated grapefruit that you had this morning was moved by rail, it came out of the valley on one of those roads built by Lot. So he should be remembered for his opening up the valley, as well as what it did to promote Rockport and Rockport as a community at that time. Well, the story doesn't quite end there. We still have a depot, and this is a view of it today, actually, from Live Oak. You can see the typical yellow depot in the corner there. That platform that you see was the express or part of the warehousing for the depot. It did suffer from Harvey, as did the depot itself. I'll show you this picture. So right now, the east side of our depot has just been patched together. I had a meeting with the Texas Historic Commission during the week this week, and I think that we'll be able to get some funding to work on this. It's in private hands, but it's up for sale. It's got a for sale sign on it. So we're hoping that we get somebody who's really interested in history, or a combination of people who will come together to really try to do something with our depot, because it is distinctive, and it was a very, very important part of Rockport history. Again, our very favorite photo of what the depot looked like in its heyday. Okay. Thank you.